It was the summer of 2016, and I had decided to take a solo camping trip deep in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I was 23 at the time, and I thought I was prepared for anything. I had spent weeks planning the trip, checking maps, packing supplies, and making sure my backpack had everything I could need: tent, food, water, first aid kit, flashlight, spare batteries, and a small folding shovel. I wanted a break from the city, a few days of complete solitude, away from work, noise, and people. I had always found comfort in being alone in the woods, surrounded by the smell of pine and the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. I arrived at the trailhead around 10 a.m. The sun was high, the sky a perfect blue, and the air was warm but dry. I parked my car in a small dirt lot, double-checked that my pack was secure, and started the hike toward a spot I had scouted on an old topographic map. It was about 6 miles in, off the beaten path, near a small creek that appeared to have clean water. The trail started easy enough, winding through tall trees and occasional clearings. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. By early afternoon, I had reached the spot I had chosen. A small clearing opened to the creek, and sunlight dappled the ground through the canopy. It was perfect. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was secure and hidden enough so anyone passing by the creek wouldn't notice me immediately. I gathered firewood, arranging it neatly beside a small circle of rocks I used to keep the flames contained. By the time I was done, the sun had started its slow descent, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I cooked a simple meal: canned beans, a little dried meat, and some rice, and ate while listening to the creek's gentle murmur. Everything felt peaceful. I decided to explore a bit further before night fell, so I followed the creek upstream. The forest grew denser as I walked, the trees thicker, the ground uneven and slick with fallen leaves. It was beautiful, almost magical, the way the sunlight fractured into long beams through the canopy. But as I walked, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the soft mud near the creek. Human footprints. They were fresh. I stopped, crouching to look closer. They weren't mine. Mine were on the other side of the creek. A knot of unease formed in my stomach. The prints were large, booted, and appeared to be recent, maybe from earlier that day. I followed them cautiously for a short distance, but they disappeared into thick undergrowth. I decided not to push further. I didn't want to confront whoever it was. I didn't even know if it was someone harmless or someone dangerous. I turned back, keeping my pace quick but quiet. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun had almost disappeared, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I started a fire, small and controlled, and sat by it, feeling the warmth and watching the shadows dance across the trees. That's when I heard it. A low snapping sound, like a branch breaking, somewhere just beyond the circle of light. My heart rate spiked. I froze, listening. The snapping continued, irregular, coming closer but staying hidden. I reminded myself that it could be a deer or some other animal. Maybe. But the pattern didn't feel right. It didn't sound like an animal moving naturally. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, shining it carefully over the trees and brush, but I saw nothing. Night in the forest has a different kind of silence. It's not the absence of sound. It's an active presence of it, as if everything is listening and waiting. The snapping continued intermittently, each crack echoing far more loudly than it should. I stuffed my hands into my jacket, trying to calm myself. My mind started racing through worst-case scenarios. Someone following me, someone with bad intentions, someone waiting for the perfect moment. I knew I had to be careful. I kept my fire alive, knowing it was my only source of comfort and safety. Around midnight, the snapping stopped, but that only made the silence feel heavier. Then I heard something else. A soft, deliberate crunch in the leaves, coming from a different direction. It wasn't close, but it was deliberate, as if someone or something was circling me, trying to stay out of sight. I stayed still, listening to every sound. The wind rustled the trees, and the creek gurgled faintly, but the crunching was different. It had rhythm, intent. My hands shook slightly as I loaded my small survival knife and kept my flashlight ready. Hours passed like that, with intermittent noises, shadows shifting around the periphery of the firelight. Sleep was impossible. My muscles ached from staying tense, and my mind replayed every possible danger. I reminded myself that panic was useless. I needed to be alert, to protect myself if needed. By 4 a.m., the forest was quieter, and exhaustion finally forced me to curl up near the fire, flashlight in hand, waiting for daylight. When morning came, the light revealed signs of someone having been very close. Footprints circled my campsite. One had been trampled near my tent, flattened by deliberate pressure. My stomach turned. Whoever had been there last night was careful, aware of my presence, but I had no idea why they hadn't approached directly or made themselves known. I decided not to linger. I packed quickly, leaving most of the firewood behind, and started hiking back the way I came. The walk back was tense. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I kept my eyes scanning the forest, moving steadily but silently. After about an hour, I saw a figure in the distance, brief, human-shaped, standing just at the edge of the trees. It didn't move immediately, just watched. My gut told me to keep walking, avoid eye contact, and not make noise. I did exactly that, heart pounding in my chest, until it disappeared from view. I didn't look back again. Eventually, I reached the trailhead, the forest thinning behind me. My car was exactly where I had left it. I locked the doors, sat inside for a few minutes, and exhaled fully for the first time since I arrived. I drove straight to the nearest small town, getting a hot coffee and a bite to eat. I stayed in town for the night, refusing to sleep in the woods again. Looking back now, I realize how lucky I was. That experience could have gone badly, but nothing happened. The forest itself hadn't changed. It was the presence of another human that made it terrifying. I learned that day that being alone doesn't always mean being safe, that caution and awareness can literally save your life, and that even in a place as peaceful as a quiet forest, danger can be lurking just beyond the trees. I returned to camping many times after that, but I never went that deep, that remote, without a companion again. And every time I hike near that part of the Allegheny, I think about the night I spent circled by someone unseen, and I make sure I'm never caught unprepared again. I remember the summer of 2018. I was 22, and I had decided to go on a solo camping trip in the dense forests of northern Michigan. I had always been drawn to the quiet of the woods, the kind of isolation where the world seemed to stop, leaving only the wind in the trees and the slow hum of nature. I had rented an old Jeep, packed my tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, enough food for 4 days, and a decent amount of water. I thought I was prepared. I thought I knew what to expect. I was wrong. I arrived at the campsite just after noon. It was in a small clearing near the edge of a lake that wasn't on most of the maps I had studied. The water was dark green, almost black in some areas, and the shoreline was scattered with fallen branches and thick patches of reeds. The trees were tall and close together, a mix of pines and maples, their shadows stretching long in the early afternoon sun. I chose a spot near the water but far enough from the dense treeline so I wouldn't be completely enclosed. I set up my tent, built a small fire pit, and organized my supplies. First, everything felt perfect. The sun was warm, the breeze was soft, and the forest smelled alive. But as evening approached, the first strange sensation hit me. The kind of uneasy feeling you can't explain, like someone or something is watching, though the forest was silent. No birds, no rustling animals, nothing. Just a weight in the air that pressed against your chest. I brushed it off as nerves. I was alone, after all. That night, around 11 p.m., I was lying in my sleeping bag when I heard the first sound that made my stomach tighten. A faint snap, like a branch breaking under weight, but slow, deliberate. I froze, heart pounding. Then another, and another. They were coming from the treeline, not the lake. My mind raced. Bears could snap branches, deer too, but the way it sounded measured, careful, almost like someone was circling me, testing. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, that I was imagining things, but the sound kept coming closer. I grabbed my flashlight and leaned out of the tent, shining it toward the trees. The beam bounced off nothing. No eyes reflecting back, no movement, just shadows and leaves. I considered staying in the tent, but something told me to keep an eye out. I shone the light along the path I had taken to the lake, and that's when I saw it. Footprints. Not animal footprints, human. Large, heavy, heading toward my tent from deeper in the forest. I swallowed hard and backed into my sleeping bag, debating my options. I didn't have cell service. I had told no one exactly where I was going. Panic set in slowly, creeping through my body. I could hear the sounds now, low rustling, almost like someone dragging something through the underbrush. The wind shifted, carrying a faint smell of smoke and dirt. My mind started to imagine the worst scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. I kept the flashlight in hand, barely daring to breathe. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. By 3 a.m., I had convinced myself to leave before daylight. I packed as quietly as possible, slipping into my boots and grabbing my backpack. I didn't have a map of the deeper forest paths, but I knew the main trail back to my Jeep. I moved carefully, listening to every snap of twigs and rustle of leaves. Something followed me. I could feel it, always just on the edge of my senses. I made it about half a mile from the lake when I realized I had underestimated the forest's density in the dark. The trail was barely visible, overgrown in places, and my flashlight's beam bounced off thick branches, casting shadows that seemed alive. Then I heard a sound that made me freeze in terror. A branch snapping directly behind me, followed by another. I spun around with the flashlight and saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I ran, not a normal jog, but full sprint, tripping over roots, scratching my arms and legs on branches. My heart felt like it would explode. I lost the trail for a moment, and in that moment, I was certain something was closing in on me. I could hear it moving, quick, heavy, confident. My only thought was to get to the Jeep. I ran blindly, following the faint outline of the path I had taken earlier. After what felt like an eternity, I broke through the underbrush into the clearing where I had parked. The Jeep was there, exactly where I had left it, but the tires were partially sunk in soft dirt, as if someone had been leaning on it. My stomach dropped. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I kept the lights off, waiting, listening. Nothing. Slowly, I eased out of the clearing, keeping the windows up and the doors locked. My mind was racing with what could have been following me, what might have been watching me for hours. Every shadow along the road made me flinch. It took over an hour to reach the nearest gas station, a tiny outpost on the main highway. The fluorescent lights were harsh but comforting. I went straight inside, shaking, and told the cashier I needed to use a phone. I called my friend back home and told him to alert someone if I didn't return. I didn't sleep much that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the sounds, and the fact that whoever or whatever had been in those woods, they had been patient, intelligent, and dangerous. In the following weeks, I learned from locals that the area had been used by hunters who sometimes stayed hidden for days. That explained the footprints and the way whatever followed me seemed to know I was there without revealing itself fully. I realized then that the scariest part wasn't some supernatural entity. It was humans, alone in the wild, unprepared. You're vulnerable in ways you can't imagine. I never went back to Michigan forests alone. I became obsessed with checking maps, planning routes, and making sure someone knew my exact location. I kept my camping trips to more controlled environments with friends or in well-patrolled parks. And even years later, when I remember that night, I still feel that weight in the chest, the creeping awareness of being watched, the sound of snapping branches in the dark. The lesson I took away was clear. Nature is unpredictable, and humans are even more so. Preparation isn't just about food or water. It's about understanding the risks you can't see, the people you can't anticipate, and respecting the isolation that can quickly turn dangerous. That night in the forest taught me more about fear, caution, and survival than any story or warning ever could. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I was 23, working a job that drained me, and I needed a weekend away from everything. The city noise, the endless emails, the people. I wanted silence, solitude, and the kind of fresh air that made your lungs feel like they were washing out years of dust. I had done plenty of day hikes before, but this would be my first real solo overnight trip, and I thought I was prepared. I packed my old, beaten-down backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, some canned food, a few granola bars, water, a map, and a compass. I even brought a small folding hatchet and a flashlight with extra batteries. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, the fact that I didn't bring a fully charged phone or a satellite communicator would become important. The hike in wasn't too difficult at first. The trail was overgrown in parts, but it followed the contour of a small creek, and the sunlight filtering through the dense canopy made everything look like it belonged in a National Geographic photo. Birds called out intermittently, and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush gave me a comforting sense of life around me. I walked for about 5 miles before I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for camping. A half-fallen tree formed a natural barrier on one side, and a cluster of pines offered some shelter from the wind. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the stakes were tight and the fly was secure, then went to gather firewood. By late afternoon, the sun was dipping behind the thick trees, and shadows grew long and heavy. I managed to build a small fire with some dry twigs and branches I found nearby. The smell of burning pine filled the air. I cooked a small meal, ate quietly, and then sat back against a log, letting the forest sounds wash over me. That's when I first noticed something odd. It started as a faint snapping of twigs, almost like someone stepping carefully through the brush. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the steps didn't move in the way an animal's would. They were too deliberate, too quiet, and they seemed to circle the clearing slowly. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or the wildlife. I tried to push the thoughts away, but as night fell and the temperature dropped, I felt a tightening in my chest I hadn't expected. I crawled into my tent around 9 and tried to sleep. Outside, the forest was alive. The wind whispered through the branches, and occasional groans of large trees settling into the night sounded almost like voices if you focused too hard. At some point, I swear I heard a low grunt, muffled and distant. I froze. My mind raced, imagining a bear or some large animal, but I had never heard a bear make that exact sound. I lay perfectly still, listening to the forest, my hands trembling slightly. Around midnight, the situation escalated. I had been dozing fitfully when a loud crack came from just outside my tent. My flashlight was within reach, and I grabbed it, heart hammering. I unzipped the tent slightly and shone the beam into the dark, but all I saw were the shapes of trees and the faint outline of my fire, now smoldering. I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. Something crouched low, moving unnaturally fast. I couldn't tell if it was human or animal, but the fact that it avoided the firelight entirely made my stomach twist. I retreated into my sleeping bag, shaking. My hatchet felt small in my hand, but it was all I had. I considered screaming, but I didn't want to draw attention if whatever it was still there. Hours passed in terrifying silence, punctuated by occasional twigs snapping far away. By sunrise, I had convinced myself I wasn't going to survive the night. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. I had only packed for comfort, not defense. My food was gone, my fire was dead, and I realized I had no clear plan if something really was stalking me. I waited for the first light to get a clear view of my surroundings. When I unzipped the tent fully, I noticed something unsettling. My fire pit had been disturbed. The ashes were scattered, and a large footprint was pressed into the soft dirt beside it. It wasn't human. It was long and wide, with claw marks digging into the earth. I didn't know what it was, but I didn't wait to find out. I packed my things with shaking hands, trying to be quiet, and kept my hatchet in front of me. I hiked the trail out slowly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I didn't see the creature, but the signs were everywhere. Broken branches, deep scratches in tree trunks, and more footprints crossing my path. Every shadow looked alive. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. I remembered the map and compass, and I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on one step at a time. Hours passed, and finally, I reached a small gravel road where I could see the edge of the forest. A car passed by, and I ran toward it, waving my arms like a maniac. The driver slowed, looked confused, but eventually stopped. I scrambled in, gasping, pointing to the forest behind me. The police were called, but by the time they searched the area, nothing was found. No animal tracks that matched, no signs of another person. Only the marks on the trees and the disturbed campsite remained. I later learned that in those parts of the Allegheny forest, black bears were common, and occasionally people reported seeing unusually large ones. I like to think that's what I saw, though part of me can't shake the feeling it was something else entirely. Something intelligent, patient, and watching. I never went back to that part of the forest. I stopped camping alone after that trip. But the lesson stayed with me. Nature isn't kind, it isn't fair, and it doesn't care about your plans. Being prepared isn't just about packing food and water. It's about respecting that the woods are alive with things that don't want you there. That trip changed the way I view solitude, the way I handle fear, and the way I prepare for anything in the wild. I came home tired, shaken, and grateful to see my apartment again. Every time I close my eyes and picture that forest, I can still see the outline of whatever was lurking just beyond the firelight, patient, silent, and waiting. But I survived. I learned to respect the forest, and in a way, that respect saved me. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just turned 23. I had been itching for a solo camping trip for months, ever since my last long stretch of work ended. I drove my old Toyota pickup out of the city, the sun hot on the asphalt and my backpack loaded with nothing but the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, some canned food, water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and my old hunting knife my grandfather had given me years ago. The plan was to camp in the remote woods of northern Maine, where the trees were dense, the air was crisp, and the silence was heavy. The drive had been long, but I loved it. I left the paved roads behind and followed a dirt trail that wound deep into the forest. The kind of trail where a single wrong turn could mean getting lost for hours. I kept my eyes on the path, noting the way the trees thinned in some places and thickened in others, committing landmarks to memory. By late afternoon, I found a clearing near a small creek. The ground was flat, and the sound of water rushing over rocks was soothing. I parked, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I had expected the sounds of birds and frogs, but by 10 o'clock, even they had faded. The only noise was the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. I cooked some beans and rice over my stove, then lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the mesh of my tent. The forest was supposed to be safe, but there's something about being completely alone that changes your sense of security. My mind drifted, imagining all the ways something could go wrong. Getting lost, falling, or worse. But I told myself I was careful and experienced enough to handle it. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a faint crackling noise outside the tent. My heart started racing. I froze, straining to listen. The sound wasn't like wind or leaves falling. It was deliberate, slow, like footsteps on dry branches. My flashlight sat on the floor of the tent, and I considered grabbing it, but I didn't want to alert whatever it was that I was awake. The footsteps continued, moving around the perimeter of my campsite. I remembered the knife in my backpack and slowly reached for it. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence. I held my breath, trying to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but there was something off about the rhythm. It wasn't quick like a startled animal, and it wasn't random. It moved in careful, calculated steps, circling. I waited another 10 minutes before daring to shine my flashlight outside. The beam swept across the clearing, the creek, the edges of the forest, and I didn't see anything. Nothing. The rest of the night was a tense blur. I didn't sleep well. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jolt awake. When morning finally came, I packed quickly. The thought of staying another night in that spot was unbearable. I told myself it was nothing more than the imagination running wild. Maybe someone had hiked close by, or maybe it was an animal that had been curious about my tent. But the unease didn't leave me. I hiked a few miles down the trail that morning, following the creek upstream. The forest looked different in the light of day. Sunlight poured through the trees and shafts, and the air smelled like wet pine and earth. I found another clearing and decided to set up a new camp. This one was farther from the road and more hidden, and I thought maybe, just maybe, the night would pass quietly. That evening, as I was collecting firewood, I noticed footprints in the dirt near the creek. Large, heavy footprints, the kind you would expect from a human. But they were weirdly spaced, like whoever made them had been walking slowly, carefully, trying not to disturb the ground too much. My stomach sank. I had been completely alone for hours. No other hikers had come by. Whoever had left the footprints had either been watching me or following me. I built my fire quickly and ate dinner while keeping my knife close. As the sun dipped below the trees, shadows stretched long and thin, turning the forest into a labyrinth. The wind picked up, and I could hear the trees creaking. Then I heard it again, the footsteps, this time much closer. They moved from the creek toward my tent, slow, deliberate. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and quietly slipped out of my tent, crouching behind a tree. The beam of light caught a figure moving slowly through the underbrush. A man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, moving like he knew the forest well. I froze, unsure what to do. He didn't see me at first, just wandered near my campsite, looking around. My instincts screamed to run, but I knew running would make noise and give away my position. I stayed hidden until he finally walked past the creek and disappeared into the trees. When I was sure he was gone, I packed my gear as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, my stomach tight with fear. I didn't take the time to eat or make a fire. I just hiked, fast but careful, following the trail I had come in on. The forest seemed endless, but I pushed myself to keep moving, trying to stay calm, trying not to think about him possibly watching me from somewhere behind the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the road. Hours later, my legs sore and my pack heavy. My truck was where I had left it, and I climbed inside, locking the doors and trembling. I drove away without looking back, the forest disappearing behind me. I called the park ranger as soon as I had cell service and reported the footprints and the figure. They told me there had been a few reports of a man following hikers in that area, but nothing had ever been proven. It took me months to go back to camping, and even longer to feel safe in the woods again. But that night taught me the importance of preparation and awareness. Since then, I always let someone know exactly where I'm going. I carry extra protection, and I trust my instincts. Fear can be your greatest enemy in the forest, but so can complacency. That night, I learned both lessons the hard way. Even now, when I think about it, I can feel the tension in the air, the silence of the forest, and the sound of those slow, careful footsteps circling me. I never saw him up close, never knew his intentions, but I survived because I stayed alert, kept calm, and didn't underestimate the danger. That summer in Maine taught me that the wilderness is not just beautiful. It can be unforgiving, and it's always better to be safe than sorry. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a break from my job and head out into the wilderness for a solo camping trip. I was 24 at the time, freshly out of college, and I thought I knew what roughing it meant. I packed my old Subaru with a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, some food that would last a week, a water filter, and a first aid kit. My destination was a remote area in the northern Cascades of Washington, a place I had only scouted through old maps and satellite images. There were no marked trails near where I intended to camp. I wanted isolation, a challenge, and the sort of quiet that city life never gives you. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and wet earth from the previous night's rain. I should have noticed the sky, though. Clouds were gathering quickly, darker than I'd expected for this time of year. But the thought of the adventure ahead pushed me forward. I hiked in for about 4 miles, my pack heavy but manageable, following a faint dirt path that soon turned into broken rocks and fallen branches. By the time I found a spot that felt suitable for setting up camp, the sun was already a dull orange glow behind the dense trees. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering firs, with a shallow stream trickling nearby. The ground was soft but slightly damp. I spent nearly an hour unpacking, spreading out my tent, and securing it with stakes, making sure everything was anchored in case of wind. I was meticulous, almost obsessively careful, a habit that would soon pay off. I gathered some firewood and started a small campfire. The first sparks caught quickly, and I watched the flames lick upward as I prepared a simple dinner: instant rice and canned beans. The sound of water flowing in the nearby stream and the occasional rustle of leaves overhead created a rhythm I found almost hypnotic. But as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the forest changed. Shadows stretched in ways I hadn't noticed in daylight, and the night brought a silence so thick it pressed against your ears. Around 9 o'clock, I was just about to crawl into my sleeping bag when I noticed a faint crackling sound off in the distance. At first, I assumed it was a deer or a small animal walking through the underbrush. But then the sound repeated, slightly louder, deliberate, like someone stepping on dry sticks in sequence. My stomach tightened. I wasn't entirely alone. I reminded myself that people sometimes hike at night, but a quick glance around the clearing showed no other tents. No headlights in the distance, nothing. Still, the sound persisted, stopping whenever I focused on it and starting again when I tried to ignore it. My heart rate increased. I grabbed my small camping knife and a flashlight, switching it on in short bursts to avoid giving away my position, and scanned the edge of the clearing. Then I heard it. A low, deliberate snapping of wood, close enough now that I could tell it wasn't a small animal. It was heavier, louder. Someone, or something, was moving through the trees toward me. Panic set in. I considered running, but I knew that in this terrain, running would be dangerous. I'd probably trip over a root or slip on the wet rocks. I did the only thing I could think of. I got back into my tent, zipped it closed completely, and tried to make myself as small as possible. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the noises moving around the perimeter of the clearing. Branches snapped, leaves rustled. The stream gurgled between moments of silence that felt almost deafening. My flashlight's beam caught something once, a shadow flitting between two trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept checking the tent's zipper and my surroundings, trying to calm my breathing, trying not to imagine what was out there. When the first faint hints of dawn filtered through the trees, I unzipped the tent slightly, peering out. The forest looked almost normal again, quiet except for birdsong. My relief was immediate but cautious. I decided I wasn't staying another night. Packing up in the early morning light, I moved with purpose, not stopping to enjoy the scenery or take pictures like I had planned. Every step on the rocky trail made me hyper-aware of sounds behind me. Around noon, I finally made it back to my car, heart still hammering, sweat from exertion and fear soaking through my shirt. The keys felt impossibly heavy in my hand as I unlocked the door, slid in, and locked it again behind me. I drove slowly, eyes darting constantly to the edges of the road, until I finally hit the main highway and felt normal again. Later, I learned from rangers that the area I had camped in was notorious for illegal poachers who would move quietly through the forest, sometimes hunting animals and occasionally confronting humans if they got too close. There was no supernatural reason for the sounds I had heard, just humans moving deliberately, quietly, in an area where few people ever came. Knowing that didn't erase the fear, but it explained the relentless, patient way something had been stalking me that night. After that trip, I changed my approach to wilderness trips. I started carrying bear spray, a whistle, and even a small flare gun. I learned to recognize animal tracks and human footprints, and I never camped alone in remote areas again. The memory of that night, the way the darkness seemed to bend, the sounds that weren't quite natural, the feeling of being watched, stayed with me for years. It taught me to respect the wilderness in ways I hadn't before, and it taught me that danger isn't always obvious or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and terrifying simply because it's human. The lesson stuck with me most the next time I went camping months later, in a more controlled environment with proper trails and other campers nearby. I still loved the wilderness, the feeling of being away from city lights and traffic, but I learned to balance awe with caution. There is a kind of fear that sharpens your senses rather than paralyzing them, and that's the kind of fear I carry with me now when I set out into the forest. Even now, years later, when I hear a branch snap at night or a faint rustle in the bushes, I still pause. My heart still quickens. But I also remind myself that fear can be a tool, not just a terror. Keeps you alert, keeps you alive. And that night, alone in that dark clearing in Washington, I realized how true that was. What could have been just a terrifying story became, in the end, a lesson in survival, awareness, and the strange, unsettling respect we owe to the wild. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the North Cascades of Washington. I was 24, recently out of college, and craving some time alone, away from the chaos of the city. I wanted silence, nature, and maybe a little challenge. The plan was simple: a 2-day hike to a remote campsite near Lake Lillian, known for its steep cliffs and dense pine forests. I had my backpack, my tent, a sleeping bag, some freeze-dried food, and a small first aid kit. I told no one where I was going, mostly out of habit. My parents worried enough when I drove an hour away, and I didn't want them calling me every 2 hours. The hike started easy enough. The trailhead was quiet except for the occasional bird, and the sun had just started piercing through the thick canopy. The forest was alive in a subtle, calm way. I could hear small streams trickling down rocks and the distant snap of twigs under the weight of deer I never actually saw. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing overlooking the lake. The water was a deep, almost black blue, framed by the sheer cliffs that rose like walls around it. The thought of sleeping here alone made my chest tighten with a mix of excitement and unease. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, far enough from the lake but close enough to hear it. As I unpacked, I noticed the forest around me was unusually silent. No wind stirred the needles, and the birds had disappeared. It wasn't a threatening silence, more like the world was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. The sun was still out, and I had miles of daylight to enjoy. I hiked a little closer to the lake, tracing the shoreline where the water lapped gently against rocks. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine resin and wet earth. I collected some dry branches for a fire and carried them back to my tent. By the time I started the fire, the sun had dipped behind the cliffs, and shadows stretched long and black across the clearing. I cooked a small meal and sat quietly, watching the flickering flames dance across the rocks. That's when I first noticed it, a faint crunching sound from the woods across the clearing. At first, I assumed it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like someone or something was walking on purpose, not foraging. I froze, straining my ears. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. My stomach twisted. I reminded myself that people hike these trails too. Maybe it was another camper or a lost hiker. But the trailhead was miles back, and no one had passed me that day. My heart was pounding when I decided to ignore it. I told myself I was overthinking it. I double-checked my tent zippers, took out my flashlight, and decided to keep it handy. The night fell quickly. The temperature dropped sharply, and the forest became a canvas of deep shadows. The fire crackled, but I could hear the occasional branch snap from the woods, faint but unmistakable. Every time I glanced toward the trees, a shadow seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision. I convinced myself it was nothing, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I crawled into my sleeping bag but left my knife within reach. Sleep came in fits, my ears alert to every sound. The distant roar of the lake, the rustling of branches, the cracking of twigs that could be bears or something else. Around 2 a.m., the sounds grew louder. Footsteps, not random. Someone was walking slowly toward the clearing. My stomach sank. My rational mind argued it could be another hiker, maybe a hunter, but everything about the sound screamed wrong. I tried to stay calm. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the woods. The beam caught nothing but trees. Then I heard the footsteps stop, maybe 20 feet from my tent. I held my breath. The fire was nearly out, so the forest was almost pitch black. Then a low rustling moved closer, like someone brushing against the shrubs. My hands shook. I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but no signal. That's when I realized I was utterly alone, miles from the nearest road, completely cut off. I remembered my training. Keep calm, make noise, make myself a hard target. I grabbed my flashlight and started shouting. Just my voice, loud and strong, piercing the night. The rustling stopped instantly. Silence. Then, after a long moment, a snap of a branch, then silence again. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag and started moving. I didn't follow any trail, just went downhill toward the lake, thinking maybe I could find a path along the shore. The undergrowth was thick, tearing at my clothes and scratching my arms, but adrenaline made me push forward. I reached the lake and crouched behind a fallen log, panting, trying to hear if the footsteps had resumed. Nothing. The only sounds were the water lapping against rocks and the wind moving the pine needles. I sat there for what felt like hours, shivering, imagining every possible scenario. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe some animal had made the sounds, but my gut told me otherwise. By dawn, the fear had dulled to a tense alertness. The forest looked peaceful again, almost normal. I made my way back to the tent, cautiously, scanning every shadow. Everything looked as I left it. I packed up quickly, deciding I wasn't staying another night. I followed the trail out, moving as fast as I could without falling. My legs ached from the rough terrain, but I kept going. Around late morning, I reached the trailhead. My car was exactly where I had parked it. No signs of anyone else. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. I drove back to civilization, hands gripping the wheel tightly, eyes darting to every shadow along the road. I didn't stop until I reached a small diner 20 miles away, where I finally allowed myself to eat and drink without shaking. Looking back now, I still don't know what was out there that night. No one believed me when I told the story. Some said it was a bear, maybe a mountain lion. But the footsteps, the deliberate way they moved, didn't match any animal I've ever heard. Whatever it was, it didn't follow me once I left the clearing. I don't know if it was a lost hiker, a hunter, or something else entirely, but I've never gone back to that area. I still hike, still camp, but I always check the perimeter, always leave early, and always make sure someone knows exactly where I am. That trip taught me something important. The forest is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable, and when you are alone, your survival depends on your instincts. I was lucky, maybe smarter than whoever or whatever was out there. I have never felt fear like that, and I hope I never will again. But even years later, I remember the way the shadows moved that night, and I remember the silence that wasn't really silence. And I know I will always carry that lesson with me. Nature doesn't forgive mistakes, and some things are best left alone. It was the summer of 2017, and I had decided to go on a solo camping trip to the remote Pine Ridge Forest in northern Vermont. I was 23 at the time, fresh out of college, and I wanted a break from everything: work, city noise, and people. I thought a few days in the wilderness, completely alone, would be perfect. I had planned everything carefully. A small tent, a backpack filled with dry food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a map, and a compass. I even downloaded offline GPS coordinates to make sure I wouldn't get lost. The first day was uneventful. The forest was dense and green, with tall pine trees that swayed gently in the breeze. The sun shone through gaps in the canopy, making patches of the forest floor glitter with light. Birds chirped overhead, and a few squirrels darted between trees. I hiked for hours, taking note of landmarks and following a small trail I'd found on the map. Around late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a creek that seemed perfect for camping. The ground was dry, flat, and free of rocks, and the creek made a soft gurgling sound that I found oddly comforting. I set up my tent, built a small fire pit, and cooked some dehydrated food over the flames. Everything felt peaceful. As the sun began to set, the forest changed. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the light that filtered through the trees turned golden and then deep orange. The temperature dropped quickly, and I wrapped myself in a thick fleece jacket. I noticed that the forest became quieter. Birds had gone silent, and even the wind seemed to have died down. It was eerie, but I told myself it was normal. Forests always seemed more intimidating at night. Around 10 p.m., I lay inside my tent, my flashlight beside me, reading a book. Suddenly, I heard a faint snapping sound outside. At first, I thought it was just a branch falling, but then it happened again, closer this time. I froze. The snapping wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone stepping on sticks while walking slowly. My heart started racing. I tried to convince myself it was an animal. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But the sound was too heavy, like the steps of something bigger. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent flap. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the creek reflecting the moonlight. I thought I was imagining it. I closed the tent and tried to sleep, telling myself it was just nerves. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A deliberate, heavy step, and then another, and another. They circled the tent. My stomach dropped. I kept still, hoping whoever or whatever it was would leave. Then I heard a low, guttural growl. It was too loud, too close to be a raccoon or a fox. My mind immediately jumped to bears, but I knew bears usually avoid humans unless provoked. I stayed frozen, holding my flashlight under my blanket. Hours passed. I didn't dare move. The sounds came in fits. Snapping branches, soft thuds, growls, and the occasional rustle of leaves. I didn't sleep at all that night. The fire had burned out, and the forest seemed alive with invisible eyes watching me. By the time dawn came, I hadn't moved from my spot in the tent. When I finally peeked outside, the clearing looked normal again, empty, silent. But I knew whatever had been there had been real. I decided to pack up and leave immediately. I couldn't stay another night. I retraced my steps carefully, using the landmarks I had noted the previous day. Everything seemed familiar until I heard a sound behind me. A deep, guttural growl, like a warning. My heart leaped into my throat. I spun around. Nothing, just the forest. But the hair on my arms stood on end. I started walking faster, not running, but briskly, trying to keep calm. By late morning, I found a small logging road. Relief washed over me. I knew I could follow it back to civilization, but the forest still felt wrong. Every rustle, every bird call sounded like it was magnified, like the forest was watching me leave. I kept my flashlight ready, even in the daylight, and clutched a heavy branch I had picked up along the way, just in case. Around noon, I noticed something strange. Along the side of the logging road, there were deep scratches on several trees. Vertical, deep gouges, not claw marks from a small animal. I stopped, examined them. They were human-sized. My stomach churned. Whoever or whatever had been in the clearing last night might have been following me, and I had no idea how close it was. I decided not to look back. The next few hours were tense. I didn't hear growls, but the forest was still too quiet. I kept moving, watching shadows, staying alert. Finally, I reached the edge of the forest. The trees thinned, and I could see a distant farmhouse. A road ran past it. I sprinted the last 100 meters, my legs shaking from exhaustion. When I reached the farmhouse, a woman was tending her garden. I called out, waving frantically. She saw me and rushed over, asking if I was okay. I was shaking too much to answer properly, just nodding and pointing toward the forest. She took me inside, gave me water, and called the local ranger station. They sent a small team to check the forest. Later, I learned that there had been reports of a large black bear with unusually aggressive behavior roaming that area for months. They hadn't been able to capture it, and hikers had been warned to avoid the forest. I never went back to Pine Ridge Forest. The experience left me shaken for months. But the scariest part wasn't just the bear. It was the feeling of being truly alone, truly vulnerable, in a place that had once felt peaceful and inviting. I learned that no matter how prepared you think you are, nature has a way of reminding you that it doesn't care about plans or maps. You are small and you are alone, and sometimes that is enough to make you fear for your life. That trip changed the way I approached the outdoors. I still hike and camp, but never alone in remote areas. I check ranger warnings, carry bear spray, and make sure someone knows my exact route. I don't romanticize the wilderness anymore. It's beautiful, yes, but it's also wild, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying. And the memory of that night, listening to heavy footsteps circling my tent in the darkness, feeling the presence of something enormous and silent, stays with me. A reminder that even in daylight, the forest can hide more than you think. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the northern forests of Minnesota. I was 24 at the time, recently out of college, and I wanted a break from the city. I had been hiking a lot over the past few years, and the thought of being completely alone in the woods for a few nights felt liberating. I picked a spot deep in the Chippewa National Forest, a place known for its thick pine trees, scattered lakes, and miles of unbroken trails. The nearest small town was over 30 miles away, which sounded perfect for the solitude I was craving. I packed my gear carefully: a lightweight tent, a compact sleeping bag, a portable stove, a small supply of dehydrated food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and my trusty backpacking knife. I also brought a headlamp, a map, and a compass. No phone signal would reach that far, but I told a friend where I was going and when I'd return. I thought I was being cautious, but I had no idea what would happen over the next few days. I arrived at the forest in the late afternoon, the sun still high but beginning its slow descent. The smell of pine and damp earth hit me immediately, and I felt a kind of calm I hadn't felt in months. I hiked for about 2 hours, following a narrow trail that wound along a small river. By the time I found a clearing suitable for camping, the sky had begun to take on an orange glow, and the temperature was dropping fast. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the river to hear its constant trickle but far enough to avoid the damp. The ground was soft and mossy, and the smell of wet soil and pine needles made me feel at home. I spent the first night feeling a mix of awe and unease. The sounds of the forest were constant: birds calling their final notes before dark, frogs croaking near the river, and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Around midnight, I woke to a strange snapping sound. At first, I thought it was just a branch breaking, but then I heard it again, closer this time. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but all I could see were the tall pines swaying in the wind. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, and eventually, I fell back asleep, though the unease lingered. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I packed water, some food, my knife, and my compass, and hiked along a less defined trail. The forest grew denser as I went deeper. I came across old logging paths, long abandoned, and saw traces of wildlife: deer tracks, squirrel nests, and even a bear scat that made my stomach turn. Around late afternoon, I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. I turned to retrace my steps, but the trail markers were faint, and soon I wasn't sure which way to go. My sense of direction was failing me, and I started to feel a creeping panic. I kept walking, trying to follow the river I had heard the previous night. By the time the sun began to set, I was completely disoriented. Shadows stretched long and strange among the trees, and the forest felt suddenly hostile. The air had grown cold and damp, and the wind carried an eerie whistle through the branches. My stomach churned as I realized that if I didn't find my campsite soon, I'd be forced to spend the night in the open, without proper shelter. I picked up my pace, occasionally glancing over my shoulder at the dark shapes of trees. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, somewhere behind me but close enough to make my blood freeze. My mind raced. Bears were a real possibility, especially in this region, and I hadn't seen any other campers around. I froze, trying to listen. The growl came again, followed by a rustling of heavy footsteps through the underbrush. I didn't run immediately. I knew panicking could make things worse, and I remembered advice from survival guides. Stay calm, make yourself visible, and back away slowly. I slowly turned toward the direction of the sound and shone my flashlight. Nothing moved at first, but then a massive shadow shifted between two trees, and I could see the glint of eyes reflecting the light. My heart sank. I didn't know if it was a bear or something else, but it was big, and it was moving in my direction. I started to back away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, my knife clenched in my hand. Hours felt like minutes. The forest seemed to close in on me. I didn't know how far my campsite was, and the shadows made everything look distorted. At one point, I slipped on a wet root and almost fell. The creature, or whatever it was, paused, and I held my breath, waiting. Then, a distant call of a bird broke the tension, and the shadow disappeared. I didn't stop to check. I ran. My flashlight bobbed in my hand, illuminating the gnarled roots and low branches, and my lungs burned from the cold, frigid air. After what felt like forever, I recognized a bend in the river. Relief flooded through me. I was close to my camp. I sprinted the last stretch, tripping over roots and stones, but I finally reached my tent, panting, trembling, and soaked in sweat and rain. I quickly zipped the tent closed, set up my stove, and boiled some water. I ate a small meal, but my appetite was gone. I could hear the river and the distant wind, but nothing else. No snapping, no growls, just the forest settling back into its normal rhythm. That night, I barely slept. I kept my knife by my side, and every little sound made me jolt. I realized just how unprepared I had been for the reality of being alone in the wild. I had underestimated how dangerous it could feel when you're truly isolated, when every sound is amplified, and when the nearest help is hours away. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my gear meticulously, checked my compass, and planned a safe route back toward the nearest ranger station. The hike was exhausting, but my adrenaline carried me through. I stuck to the river, followed animal trails when necessary, and stayed alert to every sound. I moved steadily, never resting for long, constantly aware of my surroundings. After nearly 10 hours of hiking, I saw the dirt road leading to the ranger station. My legs were numb, my shoulders burned from the backpack, and my clothes were soaked and torn from branches. But relief washed over me like nothing I'd ever felt. I stepped onto the road and followed it to the station, where I finally found people, warmth, and safety. I told the rangers what had happened, and they nodded knowingly. They explained that the area was home to bears and wolves, and hikers sometimes wandered off trail and panicked when they encountered wildlife. That experience stayed with me. I realized that the forest is not a place for casual adventure. It is a place where you must respect the rules of nature, prepare meticulously, and understand that you are never in complete control. I never camped alone in such remote areas again, and I never underestimated the quiet, hidden dangers of the wilderness. The fear I felt that night in the forest was raw and real, and the relief of returning to safety was overwhelming. I still hike, but now I do it with a group, with proper preparation, and with a healthy respect for the unpredictability of the wild. That summer of 2019 taught me something crucial. Fear is not about stories or ghosts. It's about the raw reality of survival and how close you can come to being powerless in a place that is vast, silent, and indifferent to your presence. And I'll never forget the sound of that snapping branch, the shadow moving just beyond my flashlight, and the pounding of my own heart as I ran through the dark, cold forest. It was the summer of 2016, and I had just turned 24. I had decided to take a solo camping trip to the Pine Ridge area, a small stretch of dense forest in northern Colorado I'd read about in some old hiking forums. The idea was simple: get away from the city, hike for a few days, and just be alone with nature. I wasn't particularly experienced, just enough to know how to pitch a tent, cook basic meals over a camp stove, and navigate with a map and compass. I thought I could handle it. I arrived at the trailhead just as the sun was peeking over the mountains, painting the sky in pale oranges and pinks. I carried my pack, heavy with a small tent, sleeping bag, a first aid kit, water bottles, and a few days' worth of freeze-dried meals. The trail immediately narrowed into a single dirt path, lined with pine trees and patches of wildflowers. The air smelled like wet earth and resin, and for a moment, I felt that calm, the kind you only get when you've left the noise of cars and city life behind. The first day was uneventful but exhausting. I hiked for about 6 hours, stopping occasionally to drink water and take pictures of small streams or unusual rock formations. By late afternoon, I found a clearing that seemed perfect for camping. A flat patch of earth, surrounded by tall pines, with a small creek nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and boiled water for dinner. Night fell faster than I expected. By 9 p.m., the forest was completely dark, except for the circle of light my small lantern made. That's when I first noticed it, a rustling in the trees. Not loud, not close, but definitely there. I froze, listening. There are always noises in the forest, I reminded myself. Wind, animals, leaves falling. Still, the sound kept repeating, almost methodically. A rustle, a snap, then silence, and then again. I tried to ignore it and went to sleep, but the noises were never far. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I could hear birds and the distant rush of the creek. I packed up my things, but as I started down the trail, I realized the forest seemed different. The path looked less familiar. I had been careful to mark my route, but somehow the landmarks didn't match what I remembered from my map. A knot of unease grew in my stomach. By midday, I was lost. The trees were thicker, the sunlight barely reaching the forest floor. My compass worked, but every direction seemed to loop back in on itself. I was calm at first, telling myself it was just a matter of patience and paying closer attention. I slowed my pace, scanning for any trail markers or signs of human presence, but there was nothing. No footprints, no discarded trash, no faint paths. It was as if this section of forest had been untouched for decades. By late afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen any wildlife either. No birds, no squirrels, not even insects. It was unnervingly quiet, apart from the occasional rustle in the trees, like last night. That's when I saw the first sign of something being off. My pack slipped slightly as I climbed over a fallen log, and I noticed strange marks in the dirt. Footprints too large to be human, but not quite like any animal I'd seen. They were elongated with a deep groove in the center. My heart pounded as I tried to rationalize. Maybe a deer? But the shape didn't match. I decided to keep moving, telling myself I just needed to get to higher ground. By evening, I stumbled upon another clearing, smaller than the first. I set up my tent again, but I didn't make a fire. Something about tonight didn't feel safe. I sat in my tent, flashlight in hand, listening to the forest. The rustling was closer now. Not just in the distance, not just the occasional snap of a branch, it was circling me. I could hear it move slowly from one side to the other, and sometimes just a faint thump, like something heavy walking on soft ground. Sleep didn't come. Every noise made me sit upright, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a low, guttural growl. Not loud, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. I tried to convince myself it was a bear or some other large predator, but the sound was strange, deliberate, almost intelligent. My mind raced. I thought about staying in the tent, but the growl kept moving closer. My instincts screamed to get out, to run. I packed quickly, leaving most of my gear behind. I moved through the trees as quietly as I could, sticking to shadows and avoiding dry leaves that would snap under my feet. My compass told me north, but every step I took seemed to make the forest denser, more confusing. I tripped over roots, scratched my hands and arms, and kept moving. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I had no way to tell in the darkness. Eventually, I saw a faint glow through the trees. Relief surged. I ran toward it and found a narrow dirt road. My feet were bleeding, my hands scratched and raw, my clothes torn. But I was on solid ground. I followed the road until I saw a car parked near the trailhead where I had started. I didn't care if it was abandoned or if someone was inside. I reached the car, unlocked it, and collapsed into the seat, gasping for breath. After that night, I never went back to Pine Ridge. Later, I did research trying to find an explanation. People warned of aggressive mountain lions in the area, but none matched the strange footprints or the sounds I heard. Some hikers mentioned strange predators, possibly a pack of coyotes or wolves. But the scale of what I experienced didn't quite fit any reports. I couldn't explain it, but I did learn something important. Nature is beautiful, but it's not forgiving. It doesn't care about your plans, your maps, or your intentions. I came back alive because I stayed calm, moved carefully, and didn't stop looking for a way out, even when panic screamed otherwise. The scratches on my arms, the bruises on my legs, the sleepless nights afterward, they were reminders that some places are better appreciated from a safe distance. Now, when I think about camping, I still love the idea of being in the woods, but I never go alone. I check maps, GPS, and weather. I make sure someone knows my route, and I listen, not just to the birds or the wind, but to the quiet warning signs, the subtle hints that something isn't right. That night in Pine Ridge taught me that fear isn't always about monsters. Sometimes it's just the raw, indifferent wild reminding you that you are a visitor, and survival isn't guaranteed. The ending, in a way, was simple. I survived, and I learned to respect the forest in a way I hadn't before. I returned to civilization, dirty, bruised, and exhausted, but alive. And even now, every time I hear a rustle in the trees far from any city, my heart still skips a beat, because I remember what it feels like to be truly alone in the woods, knowing something is there, watching but unseen. I remember the summer of 2017 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the remote mountains of Northern California. I was 24, recently out of college, and eager for some time away from the city's noise and constant pressure. I packed my old, slightly worn backpack with the essentials. A tent I had bought from a discount store, a small sleeping bag, a flashlight, a first aid kit, some protein bars, a water filter, and a few cans of beans and tuna. I wanted to keep it simple, nothing fancy. I thought I knew enough about camping, but that trip would prove me wrong. I chose a site near a small river, about 2 miles from the nearest trailhead. The map showed a loop trail that wasn't heavily trafficked, and I wanted solitude, not crowds. The drive there took hours, winding through dense pine forests and narrow mountain roads. By the time I parked, the sun was already low, and a golden glow bathed the tops of the trees. I should have noticed how quiet it was. Not just quiet in the normal sense, but a deep, heavy silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I hiked the last stretch to the riverbank, my boots crunching on the dry needles and loose stones. I found a flat clearing, enough for my small tent, and set it up. By the time I finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest in a dim, greenish twilight. I built a small fire, careful to keep it contained, and ate a simple dinner while listening to the sounds of the river. The water ran steady but soft, a soothing murmur in the otherwise still forest. I felt a strange mixture of calm and tension, like I was stepping into something bigger than myself. I chalked it up to the usual camping nerves and went to sleep early. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a rustling outside my tent. At first, I thought it was a deer or some small animal. The sound was just beyond the edge of my firelight, slow, deliberate, like something was moving carefully through the underbrush. My heart raced. I had read about bears and mountain lions, and I knew better than to panic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed still, listening. The rustling stopped, but then I heard another sound. A low, grating snapping of branches. Someone, or something, was walking around my campsite. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a raccoon, maybe the wind. I told myself not to panic, but the sound of deliberate steps in the night was different from random animal noises. I had a small pocket knife in my bag. I reached for it quietly, every nerve alert. Then I remembered the flashlight in my backpack. I tried to crawl to it without making too much noise. My hands brushed against the tent flap, and it made a faint rustle. The footsteps stopped abruptly, almost like whoever or whatever it was listening. The silence that followed was suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to grab the flashlight. I held it above my head and swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing. The shadows of the trees stretched long and monstrous under the moonlight. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I climbed back into my sleeping bag, but sleep was impossible. Every little noise, the river, a branch snapping somewhere, the flutter of leaves, made me tense. I stayed awake, alert, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. When morning came, I cautiously unzipped the tent and surveyed the area. There were footprints around my campsite, large, heavy, uneven. They weren't deer or elk, not completely. They were human. My stomach dropped. Someone had been walking around my tent while I slept. My mind raced. Were they just passing through? Were they dangerous? The nearest ranger station was several miles down the trail, and I didn't have a cell signal. I felt a cold, creeping fear, the kind that sinks into your chest and doesn't let go. I decided to pack up quickly and leave. I moved fast, trying not to leave my own trail obvious. I took the river path I had come in on, hoping that whoever had been there had left. By mid-morning, I had hiked a couple of miles, and the sun was climbing higher, burning off some of the fog and damp chill in the forest. I was tense, constantly scanning the trees and underbrush. Every shadow looked like a person. Every distant sound felt deliberate. I tried to focus on my breathing and the rhythm of my steps, but the fear never fully went away. Around noon, I reached a small clearing where I could see the trail ahead bending around a ridge. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure crouched near the trail, partially hidden behind a tree. I froze. It looked human, wearing a dark jacket and hat, and it was just sitting, watching the trail. I couldn't see a face, but I felt it watching me. I ducked behind a large rock and waited, hoping it wouldn't move. After what felt like several minutes, it stood and began walking slowly away, deeper into the forest, away from the trail I was on. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my backpack. I stayed hidden until I was sure it was gone. After that, I didn't stop. I hiked hard, down the trail and back toward the road. Every step felt heavier, every sound made me flinch. By late afternoon, I finally emerged onto the paved road where my car was parked. Relief hit me like a wave. I threw my backpack in the trunk and sat inside the car, shaking and sweating, just trying to process what had happened. I called the local ranger station from my cell once I got a signal and reported the footprints and the figure. They told me they had had reports of trespassers in the area, sometimes dangerous, sometimes just people illegally camping or hiking. That explanation made sense but didn't make me feel any safer. That night, back in my apartment in San Francisco, I kept thinking about the forest and the clearing by the river. I realized how unprepared I had been for real danger in the wilderness. Up until then, camping had always been about peace, quiet, and nature. But that trip reminded me how easy it was to underestimate the risks and how unpredictable the world could be outside the familiar city streets. I kept imagining that figure sitting there, watching, waiting, and I couldn't help but feel a shiver every time I thought about it. I never went back to that part of the mountains. I still hike and camp, but I do it in groups now, and I make sure to check in with rangers and let someone know exactly where I'll be. That trip taught me something essential. Solitude in the wild can be both beautiful and terrifying, and there's a fine line between being adventurous and being reckless. I came back physically safe, but mentally it left a scar that reminded me every time I planned a solo trip to respect the forest and its unseen dangers. The next summer, I went camping again, but I stayed on well-traveled trails and in designated campgrounds. I took my time learning navigation, survival skills, and how to handle unexpected encounters. That night in the Northern California wilderness had been terrifying, but it also taught me something about preparation, awareness, and humility. I survived not because of luck alone, but because I stayed calm, stayed alert, and trusted my instincts when it mattered most. Even now, years later, I can still close my eyes and hear the river, the snapping branches, and feel the weight of those silent footsteps around my tent. It's a memory that's hard to shake, and I don't think I ever will. But it's also a memory that made me smarter, safer, and more respectful of the wild. That was the scariest night of my life, and the lesson it taught me was clear. Never underestimate the reality of the forest or the people, or things, that inhabit it. It was the winter of 1998, and I was 23, craving a break from the constant noise and deadlines of my life in Boston. I had found a small cabin listed in a local magazine, a simple place deep in the forests of northern Vermont, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The pictures were deceivingly serene. A log cabin perched by a frozen river, smoke curling from its chimney, trees heavy with snow. I told myself it would be a quiet retreat, a chance to think and be alone for a few weeks. The drive up was long, through winding roads that twisted between pine forests so dense they blocked out most of the winter light. My old Honda struggled through patches of ice and snow, and I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter than I expected. At one point, a deer darted across the road, forcing me to swerve dangerously close to a snowbank. My heart was racing, and I remember laughing at myself later for feeling nervous. The world was quiet up there, quieter than anything I had ever experienced. I reached the cabin just as dusk was settling. The building was exactly as it appeared in the magazine, though a little more worn. The logs were dark and rough, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of snow. Smoke wasn't coming from the chimney, which should have been my first warning. The front door was locked with a rusty padlock. I had a key, thankfully, and it fit perfectly. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with minimal appliances, and a single bedroom loft above. The air smelled of old wood and a faint moldy scent. I unpacked my things and lit a fire. The logs were dry and caught easily, giving me a sense of comfort I didn't know I needed. The first night passed without incident. The forest outside was a black wall of trees, with the occasional sound of wind rattling branches. I felt isolated but not yet uneasy. I made breakfast in the morning, trying to enjoy the simplicity: eggs, toast, and instant coffee. I thought about the next few weeks of solitude, of reading, writing, and walking through the snow-covered trails. Felt like a dream. By the second night, however, I started noticing small things. The cabin made noises I hadn't expected. Creaks and groans as the logs expanded in the cold, the wind howling through tiny gaps in the walls. I woke several times thinking I heard footsteps outside the door. Each time, I would sit up, heart hammering, only to see nothing beyond the dim light of the fire. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia. I was alone, after all, and the woods were full of animals. It was on the third night that the fear began to feel more real. I had gone to bed early, the fire dying to embers, and I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something scraping across the wooden floor of the cabin. My blood ran cold. The cabin was tiny. There was no way I could have not heard someone come in. I froze under my blanket, straining my ears. The scraping stopped after a few seconds, but my mind refused to calm down. I turned on my flashlight and scanned every corner of the room. Nothing. I went downstairs carefully, feeling the uneven boards beneath my bare feet. The front door was still locked from the inside, as was the back. Windows were all closed, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been inside. The next morning, I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a squirrel had found a way in through the chimney or a vent. I searched the cabin, looking for tracks or signs of entry. There was nothing. I kept the fire going all day, chopping extra wood to ensure I wouldn't have to go outside in the dark. Every noise from the forest made me jump. The cracking of branches under ice, the thump of snow falling from a tree, the distant howl of a coyote. I started sleeping with the flashlight in bed, and every shadow in the corners of the room felt threatening. By the fourth day, I realized I was being watched. It wasn't a supernatural sensation, it was cold, deliberate. I would sit by the window and catch glimpses of something moving in the woods, always just at the edge of the tree-line. A shadow larger than an animal, slow and cautious, always disappearing before I could get a good look. My nerves were shredded. I stopped leaving the cabin unless absolutely necessary. I wouldn't go for walks anymore. Even filling water from the stream nearby felt dangerous. Every crunch of snow underfoot echoed like gunfire. Then, one evening, I heard a voice. It wasn't words, just a low hum, almost like someone singing softly, muffled by the distance. My stomach twisted. I pressed my face to the cold glass of the window, trying to see who was out there. Nothing but dark shapes and frozen trees. I locked all doors again and piled chairs against them. My mind raced. I kept thinking about the articles I had read about isolated cabin attacks, people finding themselves stalked by hunters, drifters, or worse. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no one to call. The closest town was over 2 hours away. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed in the loft, flashlight in hand, listening. The scraping noises returned, slow and deliberate, this time closer to the cabin's walls. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it over the sound of the wind. The fire in the fireplace had gone out, leaving the cabin dark and cold. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave. I couldn't fight. I had no weapon, nothing but a kitchen knife, which seemed pitiful. I just waited. Morning brought sunlight and a fragile sense of relief. The noises had stopped. I cautiously went outside and surveyed the area. The snow was undisturbed except for my own tracks. No footprints, no signs of someone or something being near the cabin. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the terror from my body. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe I had gone mad in isolation. I stayed 2 more days in the cabin, constantly on edge, before deciding I couldn't handle it anymore. I packed quickly, loaded my car, and kept a tire iron handy just in case. The drive down the winding roads was tense. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow made me flinch. But when I finally reached the main road, I felt an enormous weight lift off my shoulders. I never looked back. Months later, I learned the truth. A man had been living in a makeshift shelter nearby, avoiding the authorities for petty crimes. He had been scavenging the abandoned cabins in the area, moving quietly through the forest at night. He had never hurt anyone that I know of, but the thought that he had been so close, watching, knowing I was alone, made my skin crawl. Even years later, I can still remember the sound of the scraping on the floor, the feeling of eyes on me in the dark, and the deep, suffocating fear of being completely alone with something dangerous and unseen. I never went back to Vermont, never stayed in a cabin in the middle of nowhere again. That winter, that forest, and that cabin became a memory I carry like a scar, an experience that reminded me how fragile safety can be when isolation and the unknown collide. It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the northern part of Michigan, near the Huron Mountains. I was 24 at the time, full of that reckless kind of confidence that comes from being young and feeling invincible. I had been camping a few times with friends before, but this was different. I wanted solitude, a true escape from the noise of the city and the constant hum of other people's lives. I thought I was prepared. I had my backpack, tent, sleeping bag, stove, and enough supplies for 3 days. I even had a small first aid kit tucked neatly in a side pocket, though I didn't think I would need it. The first day was uneventful, almost blissful. I hiked a couple of miles up a narrow, barely marked trail and found a small clearing near a creek. The sunlight filtered through the thick pine trees in streaks, and the water gurgled softly over the stones. I set up my tent carefully, hammering in the stakes until they were flush with the ground. I gathered firewood from fallen branches, avoiding any live wood since I knew damp logs wouldn't burn well. By the time the sun began to dip behind the ridges, I had a small fire going, the kind that crackled and spat tiny sparks into the air. I cooked some canned beans and rice, poured myself a cup of water, and watched the shadows stretch across the forest floor. Felt peaceful, safe. But the forest has a way of turning quiet into something heavier as darkness falls. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the sounds around me had shifted. Birds were silent, replaced by the occasional scurry of small animals, maybe raccoons or squirrels. The wind picked up slightly, rattling the branches. That was normal, I told myself. I drifted off to sleep thinking nothing of it. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a snapping sound. At first, I assumed it was a branch falling in the wind, but then I heard it again, this time closer. My heart started to race. The snapping was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like someone or something was stepping carefully through the underbrush. I froze, listening. My tent flap rattled slightly with the wind, but it didn't account for the crunching just outside. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something about the pattern of the steps didn't feel natural. Animals don't usually move like that. They don't pause and listen before stepping again. I stayed as still as I could, straining to hear over my own heartbeat. The sounds stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, subtle rustle, like something brushing against the undergrowth. I had no flashlight in my hand, no weapon, nothing but a vague feeling of dread crawling up my spine. My first instinct was to make myself invisible, to become just another shadow. I held my breath and waited. Minutes passed. I started to think maybe I had imagined it, my mind playing tricks in the dark. Then, a new sound emerged. A low, guttural growl, not long, but enough to make my blood run cold. I didn't move for a long time after that. Every nerve in my body was alert. I thought about the fact that I had seen bear warnings at the trailhead, about how black bears were common in the area, especially around streams and creeks. But the sound wasn't like anything I had heard on nature videos or from rangers. It was heavier, more intentional, and it carried a presence. It felt like the forest itself was aware of me, like something was watching, assessing. I stayed frozen until the faint hint of dawn lightened the sky. When I finally dared to unzip my tent, the first thing I noticed was that my firewood was disturbed. Small pieces had been scattered around the clearing. Nothing was taken, nothing destroyed, but it was enough to tell me I hadn't imagined the previous night. I packed up quickly, deciding that moving to another spot would be safer than lingering. I didn't want to make a fire this early. Fire draws attention, and I wasn't ready to confront whatever had been near me. I hiked deeper into the forest, staying close to the trail this time, even though it wasn't much marked. The terrain grew steeper, and the trees denser, but I was alert, watching shadows and listening to every sound. I avoided open spaces, sticking to areas where I could see further in every direction. Around mid-morning, I came to a small ridge overlooking a narrow valley. The view was breathtaking, mist curling along the stream below, but I didn't stop to admire it. That afternoon, I found a second clearing that seemed safer, protected by a series of dense evergreens. I set up my tent again, this time keeping it closer to the base of a large pine. I made a small fire, enough for cooking but not for bright light. I kept my knife close and arranged my bag so I could grab it quickly. Hours passed and night fell again. I tried to sleep but barely got an hour before I heard it again. The same rustle, the same low growl. I realized that the noises weren't random. They were circling me, keeping a distance, testing me. I could hear heavy breathing, not mine, echoing faintly through the trees. My mind raced. I thought about hiking out immediately, but the nearest road was miles away. The idea of navigating the forest in the dark terrified me more than staying put. So I waited, holding my knife and listening. The rustling came closer, paused, then retreated, and this went on for hours. My body was tense, jaw locked, hands gripping the knife until they cramped. By the time morning came, my arms ached from holding it, and my sleep-deprived brain felt sharp and fragile at the same time. The third day, I made a plan. I would pack up at first light and hike directly back to my car, no detours. I kept my ears open for any signs, any hint of movement. I didn't make a fire in the morning. I didn't even eat, just drank a little water and kept moving. The forest seemed alive in a way I had never noticed before. Every bird call, every rustle, every shifting branch magnified. I kept my knife ready, my eyes scanning for eyes in return. After a grueling 6-hour hike, stumbling over roots and rocks while staying alert to every sound, I finally reached the gravel road. My legs were shaking from exhaustion, adrenaline, and fear. When I climbed into my car, the relief hit me in waves. I had made it out unhurt, alive. My supplies were half used, my clothes dirty and torn from underbrush, but I was safe. Driving away, I looked back at the dark line of trees, silent and still under the noon sun. I never saw what had been stalking me, and I never wanted to. In hindsight, I realized it was likely a large predator, maybe a bear or even a pair of bears, curious and cautious but not aggressive. The experience left me shaken, but it also left me more aware, more respectful of the wilderness. Since that trip, I've gone camping a few more times, always in groups, always with bear spray and more caution, never underestimating the forest. That trip taught me something important. Fear in the wilderness isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about respect, vigilance, and understanding your own vulnerability. The forest isn't waiting to scare you. It simply exists, and if you aren't careful, it reminds you of your fragility. I survived that night and the two that followed because I kept calm, stayed aware, and respected the space around me. And that knowledge, real, raw, and hard-earned, stayed with me long after I left the Huron Mountains behind.